Essentially, what our government is doing through the Finance Committee is investigating allegations that offshore funds have improperly been funneled through, laundered, if you will, that's a fairly accurate word, through Canadian organizations that have charitable status. Their objectives are to obstruct and to delay the reasonable process of environmental assessments.
That's the Environment Minister Peter Kent on this program last night, accusing some Canadian charities of laundering foreign funds. He didn't name any names, but that's a pretty strong word. The government is changing the rules when it comes to tracking where charities spend their money. They are allowed, just to let you know, to put only 10% into any political cause. Now, there may be some that are or are not using that properly, but are they laundering foreign funds? The government's giving auditors more power to monitor this, but is the accusation of money laundering going too far, or is this a real problem that needs to be investigated? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Environment Minister, Michelle Rempel, is here, and the NDP Environment Critic, Megan Leslie, is here, and the Liberal Environment Critic, Kirsty Duncan's here as well. Well, good to have you all back. Michelle Rempel, let me start with you. On this money laundering, is the government really investigating if there's criminality going on, that there's money laundering through charitable organizations to obstruct Canadian projects?
Well, you mentioned in your opening about Budget 2010 and some of the measures that we're taking to ensure that taxpayers' funds are used properly when it comes to organizations that have charitable status with regard to their political activity. You know, this is something that we heard over the last few years as a concern within the Canadian community. That's why the measures were in the budget. The Finance Committee is in the Senate is studying some of these issues right now. We just want to make sure that taxpayer funding are used properly, and that when an organization has charitable status, that they're working on activities that are in their scope as set out in the tax guidelines of Canada. I
get that. Fair enough. But once the ministers twice, both on the House and on this program, says money laundering, are they investigating? You know, that's a different level. That's a criminality level. Is the government investigating, or does the government actually believe there's money laundering going on?
Well, again, I think the minister talked about the work that was going on in the Finance Committee. You know, as parliamentarians, we have the opportunity to investigate issues of import to the country. And again, as we set out in Budget 2012, we want to just make sure that we have the right policy to ensure that taxpayers' money with regard to charitable status organizations are being used within scope.
Let's get Megan Leslie's view on this. What do you make of this? I mean, the question now is it just about functioning within the scope, or is money laundering taking it too far?
I feel like I'm in an episode of Bizarro World. I have no idea what the minister is talking about. I mean, laundering is pretty serious. It's in the criminal code. It's about taking illegal money and converting it so that the authorities don't find out about it. I have no idea where he would get this from or what he's talking about. Kirsty will probably talk about this too. We were chatting with Scott Brison before the panel. He's on the Finance Committee, and he said, We're not doing a study about money laundering and environmental charities. I mean, this is just plucked from the back pocket. You know, he felt he had to say something on air, so he did. And I would argue that this is exactly the kind of environmental policy we can expect from this minister, just sort of making stuff up on the fly.
Kirsty Duncan, what's your view? I mean, there is a question of are organizations complying with the rules, and then there's the case of is the government investigating some for money laundering foreign funds? What's your view?
Well, I'd like to repeat that, first of all, there is no House of Commons Finance Committee studying this issue, and the minister should not have used money laundering. We absolutely want to make sure taxpayers' money is used in the best way, but the reality is this government wants to silence its critics. It is gutting the department, it's muzzling scientists, it's gotten rid of the National Roundtable, and it's silencing its critics. And if you gut the legislation, what is the way to stand in the way of environmental disaster? I mean, the real issue here is the government. We have a 400-page budget. 120 pages of it are devoted to so-called environmental streamlining. which is gutting. It's sweeping changes to environmental legislation, and the government is doing its best to keep this out of public scrutiny. And what we have asked is that these environmental protection issues are removed from the budget so that they can be studied clause by clause in committee and have public scrutiny.
Well, now they say they won't necessarily do that, but I just want to go one last kick at the can on this money laundering business, because we're getting a fair bit of response out of Michelle Rempel. Do you expect environmental charities to respond to Mr. Kent's comments? I did ask him. He said you'll hear more about this at committee. Will we hear more about investigations into charities for money laundering?
Well, again, I think this is just about ensuring that we have the right policy when it comes to ensuring that charitable organizations operate within their scope as set out in our tax code in this country. I think that's what the minister was trying to get at. At the end of the day, if there are organizations that have that charitable status, that are operating, that are in political ways, as perhaps might be out of scope, we've actually seen a couple organizations across the country admit to this over the last few months. But again, this is just about what we've set out in the budget, ensuring that we are using taxpayer money properly and that we have transparency and accountability when it comes to tax rules.
Well, but was it a smear? In other words, was that the wrong word? Does he regret using a word that's a pretty heavy accusation? So there's one thing to look at if they're complying with the rules. It's another to accuse them of money laundering. Does he regret? Was that a poor choice of words?
Well, Evan, I think at the end of the day, what your viewers want to know is that as a government, we're ensuring that charities operate within their guidelines. This is the scope of the study that's happening right now. It's in Budget 2010. We'll be looking at that further this year, and this is something that's important for us to do to ensure that accountability and that transparency with taxpayer funding.
I want to just ask Megan Leslie. I had Tom Mulcair on the show just a minute ago. He basically didn't apologize for calling in an article the oil sands the tar sands, still believes that development of the oil sands hurts the Ontario economy. He calls it the Dutch disease. Mm-hmm. The governor of the bank, Mark Carney, disagrees with that impact profoundly. What's your view? Just explain. He said that you have to price externalities. What's the NDP policy on that? What does that actually mean in concrete terms?
Well, we need to consider the fact that it's not just about the sort of cost of doing business that industry is telling us about. What about the externalities, the word you use? What about the way that we're cleaning up the environmental damage afterwards? What about the fact that these companies are using our lakes and rivers as dumping grounds? That needs to be factored into the cost. And so that could be through a price on carbon. I think we definitely need to have emissions regulations, for example, that the government's been promising us for years and haven't done. We need to actually calculate in the full cost of this. It's not just about buying the machinery, right? It's about the cost to our healthcare system. It's about the cost to our environmental system.
Will it mean higher prices?
I think that, that's a good question. I think there's a good way to use public policy in a really interesting way to offset that, right? We can actually take money from the polluters and help people, for example, do energy efficiency at home. So there can be a win-win here by collecting from the polluters and actually helping citizens put that money back in.
Kirsty Duncan, your comment on that. I mean, the NDP is clearly wanting to do that, to reprice it, and they're not. What's the Liberals' view on that? Should there be a pricing of externalities? That could be a tax. That could be increased prices on some things. Maybe they'll tax shift away on other things. But it's a pretty complicated process. What's your view?
Before I answer that, I actually want to pick up on something Michelle was saying. I really feel that this is an attack on environmental groups. These are attacks on Canadians, and it's really part of the government's war on the environment, its war on science. And last summer, they announced cuts of 700 scientists at Environment Canada, then cuts of 43% of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. They were going to get rid of ozone monitoring. Then they walked out of Kyoto. And now with the budget, we see they're going to cut another 200 scientists. They are gutting, they're repealing the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, or the Act. They are making sweeping
Evan,
changes
this
to
is just
Species at
false.
Risk
I mean,
Act as well as water,
this
and
is
what
pure
the
ramp-up
parliamentary
rhetoric from a party that took no action on the environment, saw greenhouse gas
that's
emissions
absolutely
rise,
ridiculous.
and we hear no
We are
solutions
the first
from them
party
over
who
the
I can't hear both of you.
actually.
For time, I want Michelle Rempel to respond now. Michelle?
Yeah, with regard to the oil sands comments you made earlier, I think you also have to recognize that we've put in a comprehensive oil sands monitoring framework this year. We're seeing government and industry work together on oil and gas regulations, which are upcoming this year. And we're trying to put forward balanced environmental policy to ensure that we have economic growth and environmental stewardship. You know, the investments that we've made into the environment over the last 6 years, which my colleagues have consistently voted against, are designed to provide that balance. Our air quality management systems, water management system. I'd like to finish.
This government
we've
has allowed the
supported research and development
too
across
far in the
government.
Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I'm out of time. I just finished, Michelle, just on the last. Can you just finish that last sentence and then real quick?
Yeah, sure. You know, the whole comment about scientists. I mean, we've put more money into research and development and taken an aggressive policy on promoting innovation, seeing science published in peer-reviewed journals, ensuring that Canada has that international reputation. I hope that my colleagues will support this instead of trying to...
The journal Nature says
I got to wrap it up for time. Not
scientists.
because I'm not interested in more of this discussion. We're going to have you all back. I did open up a larger discussion at the end there. Michelle Rempel, Megan Lesson, Scott, I was going to say Kirsty Duncan. Thanks so much for having
Thanks,
being on the show. All three of you.
Evan.
Thanks.